Hello everyone! Have you always been interested in learning the game of chess? Well, in this video I'm going to explain you how the pieces are moving and what the rules of the game are. In front of you, you see a chessboard with 64 squares. On these squares there are placed white and black pieces. Let me introduce you how the pieces are moving. We are going to start with the most important piece of the game. It's the king. If you're able to get the opponent's king, you're winning the game. How to do that? I'm going to explain you later in this video. But first, let's see how the pieces are moving. Well, the king is a very important piece, but it cannot move that easily. Just only one step at a time. So for instance, the king could go here to the left, in front, to the side again, backwards, diagonally, and so on. So let me show you. The king, if it's in the middle of the board, can only go to the squares you see in green. Let's go to the next piece, which is the queen. And the queen is the most powerful piece. It's not the most important one, but it's the most powerful piece, because the queen can move in the same way as the king does. But rather than going one step at a time, the queen has the opportunity to go wherever she wants, all over the board. Straight ahead, backwards, diagonally, and to the side. One step is allowed, but also many more steps at the same time. But keep in mind, the way of the queen is just straight. You cannot put it just on any square wherever you want, just straight lines. Then we go to the rook, and the rook is also a very important piece, like any of the pieces, of course. The rook can move in the same direction as the queen. It can go straight ahead and to the side. Let me show you. The rook can go to the left, to the right, in front and backwards. The big difference with the queen is that the rook cannot move diagonally. Therefore, the rook is little less powerful than the queen. The queen is worth 9 points, the rook is worth 5 points. Then we have the bishop. The bishop is a strong piece, but you see, the bishop can only move diagonally. So if a bishop is placed on a dark square, you see that this bishop can only play around on the dark squares and never come to a light square. The bishop is a good piece, but a little less powerful than the rook, and therefore worth only 3 points. Then we have the knight, and the knight is a tricky piece. The knight makes strange moves as it can jump. Look, the knight, as we explained it, it goes 2 steps ahead and then 1 to the side, or 2 to the side and 1 down. Let me show you in the following diagram. The knight can go to all these squares in green, and it's even able to jump over other pieces. The queen, the rook, the bishop, they are not allowed to do so, but the knight is the only piece which can go over other pieces, its own pieces, but also of the opponent. Then we have the pawn, and the pawn is only worth 1 point. And I should add, of course, that the knight is equally worth as the bishop. Both there are 3 points, the pawn is only 1 point. The pawn, very simple, can only move forward. So it can go 1 step at a time. We will see later that this is actually the starting position of the white pawn, and then you have a choice. You can move twice, 2 squares ahead, or 1. Once it has moved, it can only move 1 square at a time. Let me show you one more idea. So here we see that white has a number of pawns. He can decide. He can move the pawn 1 square. That's absolutely fine. Here, you can move 1 square, or if you want, you can even move it 2 squares. Then we arrive at another critical idea, because if you would like to capture the opponent's pieces, and I'm going to explain more about it very soon, the pawn is going to capture diagonally. The pawn walks straight, but if it wants to capture the opponent's pawn, it's going to take the pawn like this. Look, if you don't play that, if you're going to play this pawn move, then black has the possibility to capture himself. Let's go to the next. So then we see that the pawn can move only straight forward. But what happens if the pawn arrives at the other side of the board? Because it cannot go any further. The board is only limited 8 by 8. So if the pawn goes to the final rank of the opponent, you can replace the pawn and choose another piece. Not the king. There's only 1 king on the board, but you're allowed to get a second queen if you want. So for instance, the pawn goes forward and then it becomes a new queen. You can also choose another piece, but in most cases, people choose the queen because it's the strongest piece. Then I will show you the starting position. Both sides start with the pawns on the second rank. Look, the white pawns are here and the black pawns are on the other side. White is going to move in this direction and black goes down. Of course, the other pieces have their own squares as well, and they are placed behind the pawns. Let's have a look. In the corner, we see the rooks. 2 rooks for white and 2 rooks for black. Then next to the rooks are the knights. Next to the knights, the bishops. And then very important, because you see in a lot of movies, for instance, that the chessboard is placed wrong. Remember that left under the A1 square, it's a dark square. Where to place the queen and where to place the king? Well, it's easy to remember. The white queen is on the white square and the black queen is on the dark square. And next to it is the king. Now you know the starting position and you also know how the pieces are moving. Let's go ahead, because we would like to win the opponent's king. But in order to do that, first, very likely, you have to try to capture the opponent's pieces. Well, look in this position. There is a queen and a bishop, and they are standing on the same file. And white, if it were to play here, is able to take the bishop. Very nice. One more example. We see a knight and a rook. And if it's white to move, white can make this knight jump and capture the opponent's rook. And as I explained already, the pawn doesn't capture in the way it moves, but can only capture opponent's pieces diagonally. So in this case, you capture the queen like that. Let's try to explain a little bit more. Here we see the bishop is attacking the knight, but the bishop of black is also protecting the black knight. So if you do take it, there is bishop recapturing bishop. So what I want to explain with this example is that this bishop of black is in fact defending the knight, protecting the knight, and that would be just a fair trade. What is important to realize, because black's knight is standing here obstructing the diagonal of the bishop of white is not allowed to go to the squares A8 and B7, but it's allowed to take the knight on C6 or move wherever it wants. All right, let's go ahead. Now we understand the principle how pieces are able to capture opponent's pieces. Here we see that the white rook is attacking the king. We call that check. In the game of chess, if you capture the opponent's king, it's game over. But in fact, you're not really allowed to capture the opponent's king. Or better said, the black king, in this case, it's under threat and it needs to move away. Black is not allowed to do anything else. So black can still choose to go to the side and solve the problem of a check. Let me elaborate a bit on it. Here, one more example. For instance, the queen gives a check. But also in the following position, it's very well explained. You see that the white queen is giving a check. Black has to do something about it, has to move the king away. And the king can only go to the squares colored in green. The red squares, they are not available because the white queen is controlling these squares. If the king would go to one of these squares, it can just be captured. But you can go to the side, king d8, or if you want, also the move king f8 is just possible. So going away, sidestepping the check by moving the king away, it's one way of defending against a possible check. But there are different ways also. Look, in this case I've added one more knight to the position. White's queen is giving a check, but the black knight, look what it can do. It can just go to e7, it interferes. It's no longer check. The white queen is of course able to take the knight, but that would not be a clever idea because the knight is worth 3 points and black is now able to capture the queen, and then we see black is winning material with this particular exchange. So you have to be careful and always think about what is worth more. Is it a good idea to exchange or not? But most importantly, we see that interfering is a good way of solving a check. And there's one more way to solve a check. Let's have a look at the following position, because the white queen is giving a check. Now this bishop, it's standing on the board, but what people are focused on is normally what happens very close to where the last move had been played. But don't forget to look at the entire board. This bishop is actually controlling the square of the queen. So if black to move, he can capture with the bishop the queen. And that's of course also a nice way to do. You solve the check and you capture the best piece of your opponent. Let's have a look in the following example. Because the white queen is giving a check. Where is the king going? That is the big question. That doesn't look like there are many squares to go. And what you realize, in fact, is that in this position, the black king is under check, but it cannot go anywhere. Wherever it goes, it's being covered by a white piece, by the queen, and even the king is helping in this case. And note that kings are not allowed to stand next to each other. That's just forbidden. This is what we call checkmate. And checkmate, you can see it in many different forms. Let me show you one more example. This time I've placed the white king really far away. So the king is not able to help, but what white can do instead here is give a check with the queen. This is a very clever move because the queen covers all the squares from the black king. The king cannot go anywhere, is not allowed to take the queen because look, this bishop on g4, it's protecting the queen. So the black king cannot go anywhere. Once again, this is checkmate. Then I would like to explain two more important rules of the game of chess. Normally you're allowed to move only one piece at a time. So if you make a move with a pawn, then it will be the opponent's turn again. He makes a move and you're going to make a move yourself again. There's only one exception, because with the rule of castling, you're allowed to move the king and the rook at the same time. Look how it goes. Rather than going one step, the king goes to the side, 2 squares, and the rook will be next to it. Let's have a look. White castles. This is what we call short castling. You can also castle in the other direction, and that's what we call long castling. The king goes 2 squares to the left, and the other rook comes next to it from the other side. This is very important to realize, but there are a few conditions. The first rule is that the king and the rook, which are going to castle, they have not been allowed to move before. If they have moved, then it's not possible any longer. Even if the king moves 1 square and decides to come back later to the same square, that's not possible. Second condition is that the direction you're going to castle, the pieces which are in between, the knight, the bishop, and if it's on the other side, the queen, they are not allowed to stand there. So the path for the king and rook should be free. Then there's one other rule, that if the opponent is giving a check, you're not allowed to castle. You're allowed to move the king away, or maybe block the check by interfering with the piece, or if possible, maybe you're able to capture the queen, but when it's check, castling is not allowed. And here, one more example, because look, I've placed the queen on a different square. If you would like to castle short, then the problem is that the king will be on a square where it is check. So that is not allowed neither. So that is not possible. But you are allowed to castle in the other direction if you want, because the queen doesn't control the b1 square. So the king is safe, no problem. One more example. The queen is covering this square, but it also prevents the white king from castling long, because if the white king would try to castle long, it passes the d1 square. It goes through a check, and that is not allowed. So in this case, white is not allowed to castle at all. Then, at last, I have one more very special rule, because you know how the pieces are capturing, and especially the pawn. The pawn is able to capture diagonally. Look, I have advanced white's pawn up to the 5th rank, and now black decides, for instance, to move the pawn 2 squares next to it. So the pawns are standing next to each other. Now white has the possibility to take the pawn. And this looks very weird because look what's going to happen. E takes d6. The pawn can be taken away and you capture diagonally anyway. So that's a very nice little idea. Note that it can only be played at the moment black places the pawn next to your pawn. If, let's say, white would play something else, let's say, for instance, it moves the knight develops, jumps over its own piece, that's absolutely fine. Black plays another move. Now you are no longer able to take en passant. So here you see, you know all the rules of chess. You know how much the pieces are worth, how they are moving, what the goal is of how to try to beat your opponent by delivering checkmate, and you're ready to start a game of chess. Do you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe because I'm going to make much more other videos in which I'm going to explain more advanced theories. Thanks for watching and see you soon again. Bye bye.